Every night, he checked on them first. Every night, he walked past 2 warm rooms and disappeared into the dark. He gave them the beds. He gave them the warmth. They thought Dad just worked a lot. They never once suspected he was working to become invisible in his own house. One night, she followed the hallway her father always disappeared down. What she found behind that door would change everything she thought she knew about him. He wasn't just sleeping on a floor. He was building a case cod against the man who stole everything he'd worked for. And the truth was about to come out.
If you have ever loved someone so much that you disappeared a little so they could shine brighter, you need to hear this story before it ends. Because what this father hid from his own children for 2 years will break your heart, and then put it back together stronger than before. Stay until the last minute, because the truth behind that locked door changes everything. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe right now, because more real, raw, unforgettable stories are coming, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Daniel Reyes had exactly 2 rules he never broke. The first rule was that his children would never go to sleep hungry. The second rule was that they would never, under any circumstances, ask where he slept. For 2 years, both rules had held. Maya, who was 10, and Ben, who was 7, had a room each, real rooms, with real beds, real curtains, real string lights that Daniel had bought secondhand and rewired himself so they wouldn't spark. Maya's room had a wall of taped-up drawings and a shelf of stuffed animals arranged by size. Ben's room smelled like crayons and had a solar system painted on the ceiling that had taken Daniel 4 exhausting weekends to get right, standing on a wobbly stepladder with a paintbrush in one hand and a flashlight in his teeth. Their rooms were warm. Their rooms were safe. Their rooms were, in every way that mattered, proof that their father loved them beyond reason. What the children did not know, what nobody in their quiet, unremarkable neighborhood knew, was that the 3rd bedroom in their small rented house did not belong to their father either. It belonged to storage, moving boxes, an old crib frame he couldn't bring himself to sell, a folded stroller, photographs in cracked frames that he could not yet look at without his hands shaking. And in the 6-foot gap beside the water heater, behind a door with no name taped to it, was a thin folded mattress that Daniel Reyes unrolled every night after his children were asleep, and rolled back up again every morning before they woke. It had not always been this way. 3 years earlier, Daniel had a different life entirely. A life with a wife named Sarah, whose laugh used to fill the kitchen every morning, and a thriving contracting business called Coleman and Reyes, which he had built from nothing alongside his brother-in-law, Richard Coleman. Daniel had married into that family the way some men marry into money, except there'd been no money then. Only 2 young men with truck beds full of tools and a stubborn belief that hard work eventually pays off. Richard was smooth-talking and quick with numbers. Daniel was steady-handed and quick with a hammer. Together, over 8 years, they had built something real. 40 employees, contracts with 3 school districts, a reputation across the county for finishing jobs on time and under budget. Daniel had believed, with the simple faith of a man who has never been betrayed by family, that Richard was watching his back the same way he watched Richard's. Then came the accident. Sarah, driving home from her sister's house on a rain-slicked county road, was gone in an instant that Daniel would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to fully understand. Maya was 8. Ben was 5. And Daniel, who had never once imagined raising 2 children alone, found himself standing in a funeral home parking lot at 11 o'clock at night, unable to remember how to breathe. Grief does strange things to a man's attention. For nearly a year, Daniel showed up to job sites on autopilot, signed whatever paperwork Richard slid across the desk, nodded through business meetings he barely absorbed, and went home each night to 2 small children who needed him to be present in a way he wasn't sure he had left in him. He trusted Richard with the books completely, more completely in hindsight, than he had ever trusted anyone with anything. It was the kind of trust you only give family. It was the kind of trust that gets used against you. It took Daniel almost a year to notice the first inconsistency. A supplier invoice that didn't match a delivery. Then another. Then a line of credit he didn't remember co-signing, but his signature was there, shaky and rushed. From a week he barely remembered living through, 3 months after Sarah's funeral. By the time Daniel started asking real questions, Richard had an answer for everything, each one smoother than the last, each one designed to make Daniel feel foolish for doubting him. "You've been through hell, Dan. Let me handle this." That's what family does. Those words, spoken with Richard's easy, practiced warmth, had felt like comfort at the time. Daniel would later understand them as the sound of a door quietly closing. The company collapsed 11 months later, not in a single dramatic crash, but the way a house collapses when termites have been eating the frame for years. Slow, silent, and then all at once. Richard resigned as co-owner 3 weeks before the bank called in the loans, taking with him a client list, half the equipment under a separate LLC Daniel had never heard of, and, Daniel would only discover much later, nearly $200,000 funneled out through invoices for subcontractors who had never existed. What was left for Daniel was debt. A lot of it. Debt with his name on it, debt that ate the house he and Sarah had bought together, debt that ate the savings meant for Maya's and Ben's futures, debt that left him, 18 months after burying his wife, standing in an empty driveway watching a moving truck take away furniture he could no longer afford to keep. He did not tell his children any of this. He told them it was an adventure, a smaller house, a smaller yard, a chance to be closer to Ben's school. He watched their small faces search his for fear, and found none, because 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds believe their fathers when their fathers speak with steady voices, even when those voices are steady only because the alternative is falling apart in front of the people who need you most. The new house had 3 bedrooms. Daniel gave his children one each without a second thought. It was never even a decision he weighed, the way some choices simply aren't choices at all when you love someone enough. The third room became storage because he could not yet face selling Sarah's things, could not yet face the finality of an empty room where her sewing machine used to sit. And so Daniel found the gap beside the water heater, measured it with a tape measure like it was just another job site, and made it work. A thin mattress. A reading lamp clipped to a pipe. A milk crate for his few books. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and it was his, and no one needed to know. He took a second job, evenings and weekends at a hardware store, restocking shelves and cutting lumber for customers who never asked why a man with calluses like his was working retail. Between the 2 jobs, Daniel worked 70 hours most weeks. He was always home before the kids woke up. He was always home to make dinner. He never let them see him exhausted. Never let them see the stack of bills on the counter that he moved to a drawer before they came downstairs. Never let them hear him on the phone late at night negotiating payment plans, in a voice that had learned, through sheer necessity, to sound calm. There were nights in those first months in the new house, when Daniel sat alone on the milk crate beside his mattress and allowed himself, just for a few minutes, to feel the full weight of everything he was carrying. He would take out his phone and scroll to the handful of photos and short videos he had of Sarah. Her laughing at something off camera, her humming while she folded laundry, her voice calling Ben's name across a backyard that no longer belonged to them. And he would watch them with the sound turned all the way down so the children wouldn't wake and wonder why their father was crying beside a water heater at 1 a.m. He never let himself watch for long. Grief, he had learned, was something you could not outrun, but you could ration it, portion it out in small enough doses that it didn't swallow you whole in front of the people who needed you standing upright. He built routines, because routines were the only thing sturdy enough to hold a life this exhausted together. Every Sunday night, after the kids were asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a single sheet of paper and did the math. Hours worked, hours owed, dollars in, dollars promised out, and every Sunday night the numbers came out just barely, painfully, enough. He learned to stretch a paycheck the way he used to stretch lumber on a tight job, finding the load-bearing expenses and cutting everything else down to nothing. He stopped buying new clothes for himself. He stopped going to the dentist except for emergencies. He learned which grocery store marked down bread on Thursday evenings and which gas station 4 blocks out of his way was consistently 6 cents cheaper. None of it was heroic in the way stories usually tell it. It was just Tuesday. It was just Thursday. It was just the next 70-hour week. And the one after that, stacked quietly on top of each other until 2 years had somehow passed. What kept him upright more than anything else was the sound of his children's laughter drifting up the stairs while he cooked dinner, and the particular specific joy of watching Ben fall asleep under a hand-painted ceiling of stars he could point to and name, one by one before his eyes finally closed. Daniel had decided, somewhere in the rawest part of that first terrible year, that grief did not get to take his children's childhood along with their mother. It could take his sleep. It could take his back, his savings, his own bedroom, even his name from the company he had built with his own 2 hands. It was not allowed to take the sound of two kids laughing at dinner, and so Daniel built his entire remaining life around protecting that one small, stubborn thing. For 2 years, the system worked, in the way that a body works even after it has been asked to carry far more than it should. Maya, sharp and observant in the particular way of children who have lost a parent too young, began to notice things anyway. She noticed that her father's eyes had permanent shadows under them. She noticed that he flinched sometimes when he bent down too quickly, a hand going to the small of his back. She noticed, and this was the detail that finally would not let her rest, that in 2 years of living in that house, she had never once seen her father's bedroom door. It started as a small curiosity, the kind children carry around for weeks without acting on. But curiosity in a 10-year-old who has already learned that the adult she loves can disappear without warning, as a way of curdling into something closer to fear. What if Dad was sick? What if he was hiding something bad? What if, and this thought frightened her more than she could explain, he didn't actually have a room at all, and that meant something was wrong that nobody was telling her. One Tuesday night in October, with rain tapping steadily against her window and her brother long asleep, Maya lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The hallway floorboard that always creaked near Ben's door, the low murmur of her father's footsteps checking on them both, the sound of him walking past her door and continuing down the hall toward the laundry room instead of turning toward what she had always assumed, without ever really thinking about it, was his own room somewhere she simply hadn't explored. She got up. She told herself she was only getting water. She was 10, and she was scared, and she padded down the hallway in her sock feet with a small flashlight clutched in one hand, past the bathroom, past the linen closet, until she stood in front of an unmarked door she had walked by 1,000 times without ever once wondering what was behind it. She pushed it open an inch. The flashlight beam caught the edge of a thin, folded mattress on the floor. A milk crate of books, a single clipped lamp switched off, a rolled-up jacket where a pillow should have been, and beside the mattress, propped carefully against the water heater where it would be the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he saw each night, a photograph of her mother, laughing mid-sentence, captured in a moment of ordinary happiness that none of them had known would become so precious. Maya did not cry immediately. She stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, the pieces of 2 years rearranging themselves in her mind. The exhaustion she'd mistaken for just being tired, the flinching she'd mistaken for nothing at all, the quiet, steady sacrifice she had walked past every single night without knowing its name. And then, quietly, so as not to wake her brother, she began to cry, standing in the doorway of the smallest, saddest, most loving room she had ever seen. Daniel found her there 20 minutes later, having gone to check on her when he heard the bathroom door that never opened. He stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the sight of his daughter, sitting cross-legged on his mattress, holding the photograph of her mother against her chest, and understood immediately that the second rule, the one rule he had never once broken, was over. He sat down beside her without a word at first. The water heater hummed. Rain continued against the small high window near the ceiling. "You gave us your room," Maya finally said, not as a question. Daniel exhaled slowly, the way a man exhales when he has been holding his breath in one way or another for 2 years. "You needed real rooms," he said. "You and your brother. You needed somewhere that felt like home. This is fine for me. I don't need much." "You need a bed, Dad." "I have a bed," he said, gesturing at the thin mattress with something close to a smile. "It's a very small bed." Maya didn't laugh. She looked at the photograph in her hands, then back at her father's face, older than it should have been for 38, tired in a way she was only now old enough to fully see. "Why didn't you tell us about the company, about Uncle Richard, about the money?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He had rehearsed somewhere in the back of his mind 100 versions of this conversation for exactly the day it might arrive, and none of the rehearsed versions felt right now that his daughter's eyes were on him, waiting. So instead of a rehearsed answer, he gave her the true one. "Because you'd already lost your mom," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to let you lose the feeling of having a home too, even if I had to build that feeling out of almost nothing, even if it meant I slept next to a water heater for a while." He reached over and gently tucked a loose curl behind her ear, the way he used to when she was small enough to fall asleep on his chest. "That's not a sad story, Maya. That's just what love looks like sometimes. It doesn't always look like it does in the movies. Sometimes it looks like a folded mattress and a bad back. Maya, who was 10 and had just learned something about her father that would live in her for the rest of her life, did not fully understand yet the size of what he had carried. But she understood enough to reach over and hug him, fierce and sudden, the flashlight rolling off the mattress and casting long shadows up the wall. What Daniel did not tell Maya that night, because some things a 10-year-old does not yet need to carry, was that Richard Coleman had resurfaced 3 weeks earlier, and not with an apology. He had shown up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, driving a truck nicer than any truck Coleman and Reyes had ever owned, wearing the same easy smile that had once made Daniel believe family meant something unbreakable. He had come, he said, with an opportunity. A development group was buying up the block Daniel's rental house sat on, and Richard, through the very shell company he had used to siphon money out of their old business, was the one brokering the deal. If Daniel signed a quit-claim waiver releasing any remaining legal claim to Coleman and Reyes's old assets and equipment, Richard could make sure Daniel's landlord got a fair buyout that would let Daniel and the kids stay through the school year before relocating. If Daniel didn't sign, Richard mentioned almost casually, things could get complicated fast, and complicated things had a way of moving quickly for people without lawyers on retainer. It was, Daniel understood immediately, not an offer at all. It was a threat wearing a friendly voice, the same voice that had once told him, "Let me handle this, that's what family does." Richard was betting correctly that a man working 70 hours a week with 2 kids to raise had neither the time nor the money to fight back. What Richard did not know was that Daniel had spent the last 8 months, in the rare hour here and there after the children were asleep, quietly rebuilding the very case Richard believed had died with the company. It had started almost by accident. Cleaning out a storage unit he could no longer afford, Daniel had found a banker's box of old job files he'd forgotten existed. Invoices, subcontractor agreements, bank statements from the final 18 months of Coleman and Reyes, water-stained but legible. Something in him, some old instinct for finishing what he started, had made him keep the box instead of discarding it. Late at night, on the milk crate beside his mattress, under the light of a clipped lamp, Daniel had begun going through the numbers the way he used to go through blueprints, slowly, patiently, looking for the place where the load-bearing wall didn't quite line up. What he found over 8 months of exhausted, determined evenings was a paper trail. Invoices for subcontractors who, according to state licensing records Daniel requested one by one from the county office on his lunch breaks, did not exist. Payments routed to an account that shared a signer with the very shell company now trying to broker the sale of Daniel's block. A pattern, once he saw it clearly, that could not be explained away by Richard's easy smile or comforting phrases. Daniel was not, by nature or training, a man built for confrontation, but he was a man who had spent his whole working life reading structures for weakness, and he had found the weakness in Richard's. He had not planned to move quickly. But Richard's visit, and the quiet menace behind his offer, changed that. 2 days after Maya found him in the laundry room, Daniel sat down with Frank Delgado, an old co-worker from the early Coleman and Reyes days who had left the company a year before it collapsed, uneasy even then about Richard's bookkeeping. Frank, now working for a different contractor, knew a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who took cases like Daniel's on contingency because she had, in her own words, a specific hatred for men who steal from grieving families and call it business. Within a week, Priya had reviewed Daniel's banker's box, cross-referenced it with public property records tied to Richard's shell company, and confirmed what Daniel had suspected but never quite let himself believe. This was not a gray area. This was fraud, clean and documented, going back nearly 3 years. The confrontation, when it came, did not happen the way Daniel had imagined it during 100 sleepless nights of quiet anger. It happened at a community zoning meeting in the 3rd week of November, in a school gymnasium filled with folding chairs and worried neighbors, where Richard's development group was presenting its plans to buy out and redevelop the block. Daniel had not planned to speak. He had come, at Priya's suggestion, simply to be present, to let his face be seen in the room where his neighbors' futures were being decided by a man who had already stolen a piece of his own. But when Richard stood at the podium smiling, his easy practice smile telling the room how his group intended to offer fair value to every family on the block, something in Daniel, quiet, patient, load-bearing Daniel, finally reached its limit. He stood, and in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as he expected it to, he asked Richard a single question. whether the fair value being offered came from the same account that had once paid invoices to contractors who, according to the state of Georgia, had never held a license, never existed, and never done a single day of work. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone senses before they understand that something true has just been said out loud. Richard's smile did not leave his face immediately, but something behind his eyes did. Priya, seated 3 rows back with a folder of documents she had been quietly preparing to submit to the State Attorney General's office for financial fraud that Monday, stood and identified herself, and the meeting that had been scheduled to last 45 minutes did not end for nearly 3 hours. What followed in the months after was not the dramatic, cinematic collapse Daniel might once have imagined in his angrier moments. It was slower and in its own way more satisfying. A state investigation into Richard's shell company. A civil suit that recovered a portion, not all, but a meaningful portion, of what had been taken from Coleman and Reyes, and a development deal that fell apart entirely once the investors involved learned exactly whose signature was on the paperwork brokering it. Daniel did not get his old company back. He did not get Sarah back, or the years he had spent sleeping beside a water heater instead of grieving the way he should have been allowed to grieve. But he got something he had stopped letting himself hope for. The truth said out loud, in a room full of witnesses, and a settlement that finally let him breathe. 6 months later, on a bright Saturday in April, Daniel stood in the doorway of a small, newly painted room in a house that was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely his own. Bought, not rented, with a modest yard and a bedroom for each of his children, and at last, one for himself. Maya and Ben had insisted on choosing the paint color. A soft, warm blue that Maya said reminded her of the color in the photograph of her mother laughing, the one that now sat framed on Daniel's new nightstand instead of propped against a water heater. There was a real bed in that room. There was a window that let in morning light. There was, Daniel thought, standing in the doorway with his children's laughter drifting up from the yard below. Nothing extraordinary about it at all, and that, he understood now, was exactly the point. Ordinary was the thing he had been fighting for the whole time. That night, tucking Ben in and then Maya, Daniel paused at his daughter's door the way he always had. Maya looked up at him from her pillow, older now in the way children get older, not from birthdays, but from the things they've had to understand too soon. "Are you really sleeping in a real bed tonight?" she asked. "Really," Daniel said. "Real bed. Real room. Real door with my name on it, if you and your brother ever get around to making the sign." Maya smiled. The fierce, sudden smile of a child who has watched her father carry something enormous without ever putting it down in front of her, and who has finally seen him set it gently on the ground. "Good night, Dad," she said. "Thank you for our rooms, but I'm glad you finally have yours too." Daniel stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to, the way fathers do, memorizing the ordinary miracle of a warm room and a sleeping child, and a debt finally, quietly, paid in full. Not the debt of money, though that mattered too, but the older, deeper debt of a promise he had made without ever saying it out loud, that no matter what it cost him, his children would always have a place that felt like home. He had kept that promise in the hardest possible way, on a thin mattress beside a water heater, for 2 years no one was ever supposed to know about, and now, finally, he could keep it in an easier one too. Downstairs, before heading to his own room, Daniel stopped in the small hallway closet and took out the folder Priya had returned to him after the settlement was finalized, the same banker's box worth of evidence, now stamped and closed and filed away for good. He did not need it anymore. He almost threw it out, standing there at 11 at night with the folder in his hands, but instead, he carried it up to his new room and set it on the top shelf of his closet, not as a trophy, and not as a wound to keep reopening, but as a record, proof for himself and maybe someday for Maya and Ben, that surviving something does not always look like winning in the moment it happens. Sometimes it looks like quietly gathering evidence for 8 months on a milk crate beside a water heater, refusing to give up on the truth even when giving up would have been so much easier. He thought, too, of Richard in the weeks after the settlement, not with the hot, consuming anger he might have expected to feel, but with something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. He heard through Frank that Richard had left the state, that the development deals had dried up, that the easy smile that once opened every door for him had finally stopped working on people who could look up his name. Daniel did not celebrate this the way he might once have imagined celebrating it, in his angriest, most sleepless nights on the thin mattress. He simply let it be true, the way you let a debt be paid, and turned his attention back to the two children who had always mattered more than any reckoning ever could. Maya's room was quiet down the hall, her nightlight glowing faintly under the door. Ben's room was quiet too, planets and stars painted overhead in colors that had faded only slightly with time, still bright enough to find in the dark. And Daniel's own room, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, held nothing but a bed, a nightstand, a photograph of a woman who was still, in every way that mattered, part of this family, and a man who had finally earned the right to simply rest. He turned off the hallway light, walked to his own room at the end of the hall, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, closed a door that had his name on it, and slept. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why it needed to be told. Because somewhere out there, someone is carrying a version of Daniel's sacrifice right now, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Like this video, subscribe for more real, unforgettable stories, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that love, even in its smallest, most exhausted form, is never wasted.